and we're going now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you all today to join what will be a fascinating and timely discussion on the FCA's Digital Sandbox pilot, delivered in partnership with the City of London Corporation. Innovate Finance is pleased to be hosting this session with our partners for this series, Deloitte, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more insight from our speakers. We have 45 minutes for the session, including a short Q&A. So before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. I'm sure we're all very familiar with the powers of Zoom by now, but to remind you, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please post this in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can at the end of the session. To help with that, please keep your questions brief and clear. No essays, please. So the Digital Sandbox was announced by the FCA earlier in the year, and as we come out of the worst impacts of COVID, the regulator and the City of London have entered into a partnership to test this innovative concept using the use cases that are live to the needs of consumers and businesses in the aftermath of the crisis. Innovate Finance is excited to be promoting and supporting this, especially as we know there is so much interest across the ecosystem from fintechs and larger incumbents. I am delighted to be joined by our expert panel on this subject. Francesca Hopwood-Road, Head of RegTech and Advanced Analytics at FCA. Mary Kyle, Head of Financial and Professional Services Technology at the City of London Corporation. And Suchitra Nair, Director of the EMEA Centre for Regulatory Strategy at Deloitte. So Francesca and Mary, I'll hand over to you first to tell us more about the Digital Sandbox.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I am delighted to join you all this afternoon and to very much join my fellow panel members as well for what I think and hope will be a really interesting discussion. So I'd like to kind of go back and sort of set the scene in a bit of context, if I can, for kind of why a pilot for a digital sandbox and what we're trying to achieve. And why now as well, and you've started to touch on that, Anna, I think. I hope maybe that I'm preaching to the choir a little bit with this, but we recognise that the nature of financial services means that innovation can be challenging. It's a highly regulated sector, incumbents are well established, and the sheer complexity of the systems means that digital transformation can be forced to take a back seat. And this is something that we have recognised for a while, and we have tried to engage with via a range of our kind of innovation services and offerings, whether that's the Regulatory Sandbox, which really seeks to expedite that authorisations process, whether it's direct support, which is about providing advisory service to inform new products and solutions, or our tech sprint model from the last few years, which is around for creating environments for accelerated development, identifying and surfacing new solutions, and collaborating in multidisciplinary ways. But we too need to pause and reflect and evolve our services and our offerings in light of the kind of feedback and insight that we gather from across those different pieces. And the two kind of key pieces that have been coming through to us for a little while now is around data and interoperability. And what we know is that data is increasingly the lifeblood of financial services across a lot of sectors, not just financial services, clearly. And as financial services become increasingly digital, we have seen an increasing demand for innovation support services, which I think reflect that trend more broadly. Now, open banking has laid the foundations for greater access to data. We have seen other initiatives across the globe, like Maz's Apex service. So there is a groundswell, which reflects these kind of wider trends and insights. But the other trend that we're seeing is around actually, how to surface that value for consumers, and that's around the sort of interoperability piece. Because we know that startups and fintechs and regtechs increasingly working with incumbents, rather than competing, different parts of the value chain really need to kind of work together to deliver something that's greater than the sum of their parts. So building on the work that you guys did at Innovate Finance a few years ago around, what an industry sandbox could look like, I'm delighted that we're working with Mary and her colleagues at City of London Corporation to start to kind of bring this to life and talk about it So what is it? I'm sure people are eager to hear. We talk a lot about, digital sandboxes can mean different things to different people, and I think it's really important for us to kind of be clear about kind of the hypothesis of need that we talk about when thinking about what the digital sandbox is looking like. So I just want to touch on kind of three key things that we think that the sandbox should be kind of focusing on. One is around accelerating the development of innovative solutions and practices. That's also about driving higher quality products and solutions. And I'll touch on kind of how we think about what that might look like shortly. It's also about lowering barriers to entry, specifically from a proof of concept point of view. So good ideas that otherwise might not have made it or overcome that initial inertia, how can they be developed and tested? And so one of the things that we have looked at in terms of our experience of working with the industry across fintech and regtech is, what are some of the features that we would want to kind of pilot and test out as part, and I stress that it is a pilot at this stage, pilot with the digital sandbox. And so we would look to kind of build this iteratively, but the key things we're looking at is access to high quality data sets, and I'll shortly hand over to Mary, but after that I'll talk a little bit about the data sprint that I'm sure some of our viewers now would have seen launched earlier in the week, and it's a critical part of enabling this pilot. Kind of the regulatory call to action, and I think that's really important, and that really very much links with the COVID-19 the piece and the use cases that we are seeking to explore through the pilot. Creating a kind of an observation deck, and we talked about, I mentioned earlier, the space to observe and collaborate and to kind of test and explore, get over those initial barriers around inertia. So to enable regulators and other interested parties to sort of seek to sort of understand in a bit more detail what that in-flight testing looks like at a technical level, to inform their policy thinking, but in a quite sort of with the appropriate guardrails in place. We're also looking at an API interface or a vendor marketplace where fintechs and regtechs and others vendors can list their solutions and encourage greater interoperability and foster with the aim of driving a thriving ecosystem. And finally, and crucially, a kind of a showcase space where participants can really demonstrate publicly the proof of concept that they have been working on. So, going back to the insights that we've seen from our tech sprints, for example, is creating a space where people can surface and invite kind of feedback and engagement on the propositions they're developing. But at this point, I'll hand over to Mary to talk a little bit more about your perspectives, Mary.
Thank you, Francesca. I think that's a really helpful overview. And we're obviously delighted at the City of London Corporation to be working with the FCA on this exciting project. And thank you, Ayana, and Innovate Finance for organising this webinar today. I suppose I wanted to touch upon really the role of innovation in financial services, and in particular the corporation's interest in this area. Now, we are rightly very proud of the UK financial professional services sector, and that's both in terms of how it meets domestic needs, but also of how it places the UK on the map as an international financial services centre. But as Francesca has just alluded to, we can't rest on our laurels, and we need to constantly keep evolving, and that's partly to meet changing needs. And one thing we've certainly seen over the last 4 to 6 months is how needs can really shift very dramatically across the globe. And also something that's come out of that is looking at the increasing capabilities of technology. Now, there's a lot to be positive about UK fintech. In 2019, UK fintech generated £11 billion in revenue. It raised £3.6 billion in investment. So as things stand, we can travel far and wide and wave flags for what a great job we're doing. But there are questions that we have to think about at the same time. How do we get startups to scale up? How do we actually get those initial ideas that are doing well on a minimal level to start integrating more broadly across financial services? How do we get more collaboration between traditional financial services incumbents and the emerging sort of tech superstars, if you like? And how do we, as part of that, move from fintech being the niche idea to being the norm? And I've seen lots of ideas, we shouldn't be talking about fintech, it should be tech fin. And I sort of sit in this camp of saying, surely it should just be financial services. It's got technology in it, what doesn't these days? And I think there's something really positive about being ambitious about that journey and really trying to boost that collaboration. Now, there's a lot of questions there. Some of them we hope will be considered by the FinTech Strategic Review that was relaunched earlier this week and was commissioned by Treasury. We're delighted to be involved in. But the Digital Sandbox has a really important role to play here. I think the other point I really wanted to draw out was sort of three key elements in my mind to driving forward positive information, very much around gathering ideas, aligning activity, and working towards a common goal. I've had so many conversations with tech companies that come up with this seemingly brilliant solution to a specific problem, and yet it never reaches sort of that greater market need. And dare I say, it turns out that they've provided a solution to a problem that just isn't necessarily that widespread or that high up the priority for financial services or other sectors. At the same time, we've got a financial services sector that is willing and needing to really invest in technology. In 2019, financial services firms spent £95 billion on technology. So there's a supply and a demand issue, in my view. We've got the tech that wants to provide the solutions, and we've certainly got a sector that has some issues and problems that could be well serviced by technology, but the two just don't seem to meet very well in the middle. And that's where, from my point of view, the Digital Sandbox really helps to bridge that gap. The gathering of ideas, which is at the start of that journey, providing these data assets and a sort of a safe space, if you like, to test products without having to go through onboarding, without having to deal with complex procurement processes, and without having to be at a stage of your product development where you need to guarantee success to get through the door. That's really important. So as Francesca says, we don't lose great ideas at an early stage. Aligning the activity then around those ideas is what I see the collaboration platform as doing, really providing an opportunity for tech companies and financial services firms with each other, cutting through some of the competitive elements, working together on common problems, and really working towards, as I say, a common goal. And that's where the use cases come in, which I know Francesca will speak about later. But what the Sandbox pilot does as well is it sets out three core areas where we know there is a market need for some technology solutions. So if you, as a tech company, spend the time on working towards these, you know there is a market need there, rather than, as I say, often hitting up against the fact that you've developed something that isn't necessarily scalable. So that's really just what I wanted to cover very broadly. It is a pilot and an ambitious one, but we're really excited about working on it, and we're really excited to get everything underway. And as Francesca says, I think there's some good updates even from this week, which would be good to share with you.
Thank you, Mary. I'll seamlessly pick up hopefully where Mary left off in terms of kind of the use cases that we want to go after as part of the pilot, where we think there is kind of real need, and these have very much been driven by what we're seeing as part of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that's having, and that's across three key areas. One is around fraud. And we have seen the reports around kind of fraudsters using the opportunity, if I can put it that way, of COVID to take advantage. We know that improving the financial resilience of vulnerable groups of consumers is an area that we would like to focus on, and improving access to finance for SMEs. So those are the three core groups that we call use cases that we're looking at as part of the pilot. And I mentioned earlier that on Monday we launched a data sprint, and I just want to touch on that because the data sprint is a key enabler for the pilot, and the purpose of the data sprint over the next 3 weeks, it's more of a marathon, I think, than a sprint, and probably the teams involved will feel that by the end. But it's a complex and ambitious, and actually we think a world first, in bringing together, at the last count, it was over 120 participants and observers, which I actually think is phenomenal, doing that at this time in these circumstances, and the level of interest and engagement and active participation we have had, which I think is reflected in those numbers, I think is a real testament actually, and worth kind of pointing out and reflecting on. But the purpose of the data sprint is to start to create those data assets that I talked about, that key component of the pilot Digital Sandbox. And the purpose across the next 3 weeks is to create those synthetic data assets that can then form part of that pilot. And just to put a little bit of flesh on the bones of that and illustrate that in a bit more detail, what we're talking about is hopefully, and I say this with fingers crossed, creating approximately 2 years worth of synthetic banking data that, for example, is representative of the UK financial market across banking, credit, telecoms. That's the ambition. I will stress that. That is absolutely the ambition. But what we're looking to create is, what does that mean in kind of real terms? Over 1 billion different transactions potentially in banking alone. So we have a whole host of teams that have come together to work on that over the next 3 weeks, with the ambition that ultimately that data then forms one of the key inputs for the Digital Sandbox, for those sort of synthetic data assets for applicants to kind of explore and test and their proof of concepts against. So on that note, I think I will take a pause and hand back to Iona.
Thank you both. It's incredibly interesting to hear more about your ideas and your plans for it, and also that you've got off to a flying start with the data sprint already. As you say, it's really encouraging to know that the industry is coming together to explore these ideas with so much enthusiasm. So before I go over to Suchitra, just a reminder, we've already got quite a few questions coming in, but please do keep sending them. Suchitra, I'm sure you'll agree, obviously, that this is really great to see the FCA as a world-class regulator continue to play such a central role in financial services innovation. In your view, do you think this will give the industry the sandbox tools needed to accelerate innovation? Suchitra, you're on mute, so I think you have to.
Good point. Thank you. So thanks, Iana. I mean, before I give my view, maybe worth putting it in context so people can understand where I come from. So in Deloitte, I lead our work on regulatory strategy and innovation. So really thinking ahead as to what's coming down the pipeline from a regulatory perspective, what are the supervisory expectations, more importantly, and what are the barriers that firms struggle with, and how can we bring it all together, and where are the sticking points. So as part of that, I speak to the regulators a lot, I speak to firms a lot. And what's unique about our team is that we're just focused on thought leadership and strategy. So we don't do traditional core client delivery work. So that lets us really think about what are some of the policy issues. And so that's where I'm going to come from when I give my view. So 2 years ago, we wrote a paper on the journey of firms through the FCA sandbox, because all our clients wanted to understand what are they going to get out of the sandbox. So as part of that, and reflecting on what the Digital Sandbox will offer, I think it's horses for horses, right? So for fintechs, I think this will give them the much needed data that they don't have access to, especially when they're starting off. And this has been the field that they've desperately needed. And if you look at past sandbox participants, that's one of the things that they've really missed in terms of being able to do a live test. For incumbents, yes, they have the data, but it's not always in a format that can be easily accessed and tested. So again, this provides incumbents as well with a platform to come in and test on structured data, which is fit for purpose. Again, like I said, they have data, but it may not be fit for purpose. So again, brilliant forum for them to come to the game as well. But I think the other piece that came out of our paper when we spoke to firms is that the sandbox often acts as a collaboration space for incumbents and fintechs to come together and try a joint partnership. And it's a really safe space to test innovation, but also test the business relationship and to test the model. And so from that perspective, again, the sandbox provides the tools for them to come in and try that. And Deloitte has been in the sandbox before with Onfido and Evenum. And it shows that actually it's not just your traditional players, but people in industry who want to contribute to that ecosystem will have a space to come and play. So yes.
And what else do you think needs to happen from a broader sort of policy perspective to support innovation in financial services?
So I guess, again, going back to what are the lessons learned from the previous or the sandbox experience, the traditional sandbox experience, if I could call it that, is that I think there are some great insights that come out from the sandbox testing process. And if we could bring that more mainstream for all areas, and I think we have an opportunity to do that across these use cases so that it benefits the wider ecosystem, that'd be brilliant. I think what we have also at this point in time is we've got lots of regulation, so we don't need new regulation necessarily, but we've got innovation, and sometimes that there is this place for interpreting and setting out those regulatory expectations. And I think what the sandbox does very effectively, and we see that for crypto, for example, it gives the regulator a chance to put their policy in context, but also to draw the boundaries around, where it applies and where it doesn't apply in a targeted way. And I go back to crypto assets as an example, where the FCA did a brilliant job of using use cases to explain how the policy may or may not apply. So I think bringing that learning through to policy is brilliant. The other place where I think, again, the observation deck will be really useful is for where we have situations, especially like vulnerability, and when we use AI tools, you've got the privacy regulator who will have restrictions around how to use data. You'll have the FCA who want you to detect vulnerability. And then you've got AI tools, which potentially could go out and get data that you may or may not be able to use, depending on the regulator. And I think when these use cases play out and the different regulators are able to see the potential tensions, but also maybe interpretation that could be facilitating regulation or facilitating guidance to open it up, that would be, again, a great benefit for the ecosystem. And I think this platform would allow them to do that.
Thanks, Chitra. And before we hop on to our questions, have you got any other thoughts about data, policy, or innovation more broadly that are useful for this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, my personal opinion is we've never actually had to think about data as a unique topic in policy in the past in FS. I don't think. I mean, it's always been part of a bigger objective or a bigger mandate. Whereas now we're getting into the business of financial services, dealing with data to provide solutions and services. We've got big tech players coming in. So at some point, and potentially as part of the FinTech review, I'm sure it'll come out, that there is a place where I guess everyone can step back and think about how do we deal with data and the flows of data around. And there are many lessons from open banking which show that when you can enable the flow of data, beautiful things happen in innovation, but implementation can be a real sticking point as well. So we've got the history of open banking to see how policy standards can open up channels, but also some of the friction when we try to make it a reality. So I think thinking about data and how to facilitate the flow, or how to open it up will be an interesting piece that at some point we'll need to tackle, I think, and also will be hugely beneficial for innovation.
Thank you, Suchitra. So moving on to the questions, we've got quite a few, and perhaps if I'll stick on the theme of open banking as you've mentioned it. We've had a question: what do you see as potential use cases of open finance based on current open banking trends? I don't know if it's either Suchitra, I guess, or Francesca. Happy for either of you to jump in on that one.
Francesca, do you have any views, or do you want me to go first?
I'll let you lead off first, Chitra.
So open finance is still a concept at the moment, isn't it? So we don't know where it'll take us. But what open banking has shown us is the ability to provide a single customer view to the customer. And I mean, I had a colleague the other day who couldn't get a reference in time, but the mortgage provider just asked for his open banking details, and they could go in and see what he had and approve his mortgage. So I think it can make the customer experience a lot easier, but also it can open up other channels like switching across insurance providers or utilities. But I think the next natural step is, of course, open data. So more beyond finance to sharing utility data, sharing big tech data. And I think that's where the natural flow of data is going. So the specific use cases of open finance will be essentially giving customers a better experience, but also I think increasing competition and choice in the market. Francesca, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Nothing to add to that, Suchitra.
So another question that we've had is around thinking about the use cases. We've had a question about SME finance, and obviously that's a hot topic, especially for us at Innovate Finance, who have been working very hard to sort of make the case for the fintech contribution to that through the course of COVID. We've had a question that says, great to hear that combining innovative solutions and practices can be leveraged to deliver a real solution, which are urgent with COVID, and that would be very meaningful in getting finance to SMEs at the moment. As a fintech, the sandbox could assist in providing us with that kite mark. Do you think that financial institutions would be accepting of a sandbox or kite mark solution, and is there a role for the FCA in supporting that?
So I think one of the things that we are kind of keen to sort of stress is that what we're exploring is a pilot, and what we need to really do is very carefully evaluate and explore. I talked at the top about, this is the hypothesis of things that we think is needed and we want to test, but actually through the next few months we've got to explore, is that actually are those hypotheses right? Is this actually meeting the needs in the way that we think it can be configured? And really thinking about, therefore, what does that mean across those three use cases: SME finance, fraud, and consumer vulnerability, that we have teased out, to understand kind of is the construction as the way we've anticipated it, with that ability to observe and for other incumbents to engage with. Does that give the right kind of level of engagement and oversight and ability to interrogate and understand what is going on? So I think it's going to be really crucial that we can reconstruct that kind of evaluative process in the right way, to really kind of test and explore those hypotheses to see if actually what we're getting is meeting the needs as Mary has talked to as well. It's also worth saying that in time that we believe that this is something that kind of should sit as the FCA shouldn't own this. This should be the Digital Sandbox should be something that sits and is operated separately. And I did see there were some questions about the interface with the other innovation services that we provide, and that's something that we're really alive to and we're thinking about very carefully. Particularly as we start to kind of put flesh on the bones, and I'm sure I saw questions on this as well around kind of applications and how people get involved. So there's the space we're in at the moment is kind of really teasing through kind of what that eligibility, what that application process looks like, but also kind of with that line of sight to kind of this is something that we would expect to kind of sit out over the longer term, sit out with the FCA and our kind of our purview. Mary, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on that.
Yes, sorry, and I understand my sound has been dreadful, so I hope you can hear me. Apologies. Yeah, just really to add that not so much a case of perhaps the FCA being proactive in supporting engagement, but really more about the sandbox and providing an opportunity for that engagement. It's the idea is this isn't just something for tech companies to come into, but it's to have financial institution involvement as well, to help that level of collaboration.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine two questions. I think they sort of sit in the same space, but are there any conversations with other regulators, for example, the ICO being the obvious sort of the co-participant in this, or any other jurisdiction regulators to sort of look at the interoperability across the international lines, I guess?
So if I'll take that one. So we've, in scoping this work, clearly we have been looking at, what other jurisdictions have done, whether that's MAS with APIX and others, to kind of explore, lessons learned, what they've gone after and what that's looked like, because clearly kind of thinking through kind of where we can add value and what that value looks like, I think is really important, but ultimately also kind of as you said, that interoperability piece and that cross jurisdiction. I think we're kind of in the short term, I think it's really important that we kind of scope this kind of quite carefully, and kind of it's quite ambitious. We want to do a lot in fairly short order, so just making sure that kind of we are realistic about what we can deliver for the pilot, I think is really important. That doesn't preclude, obviously, kind of a line of sight into some of those sort of bigger conversations around interoperability, cross-jurisdictional work, because we know that that's an important element and something that we're alive to. In terms of the kind of engagement with other regulators, specifically on the data sprint, one of the things that we're looking at is how we QA the quality assure the data coming out of the data sprint, and whilst it's not specifically the ICO, we are working with Turing and Cardiff University to kind of make sure that the assets that are produced are kind of the right quality and kind of are meeting those thresholds. And we have ongoing conversations with the ICO as part of our ongoing kind of cross-regulatory conversations.
Sticking to the data point, I think this is really interesting, and you might not be able to answer, Francesca, because as you say, this is still happening as we speak. Will there be any data in the sandbox that's not transaction in nature? So will there be, using transcripts or conversations or online interaction data, customer application, that sort of thing?
So I think I saw that question. I think it's a really good question, and it spoke to me kind of on a whole bunch of levels. But I think for the first iteration, we're very much focusing on transaction data. We have been very clear that the lift required to create those data sets, to that at the scale and the complexity required for the pilot, is quite significant in and of itself. Over time, there should be a conversation about what other data could be and should be included to bring that value and to bring that ability to test and explore. So the range of that data and the kind of breadth and complexity and dimensions of it is something that I think we should continue to be alive to as the work progresses.
So I think we've had a few questions, and as I'm sure you'll see, about how firms, if they're interested, want to get involved either with the data sprint or what they should be thinking about, especially I guess smaller fintechs who might seem, it's a little bit more sort of challenging resource-wise to get involved. What should they be thinking about now about how they can participate?
So I think I spotted a couple of questions on how to get involved in the data sprint. So for anyone who's watching who wants to get involved in the data sprint, if you go to digital.sandbox@fca.org.uk and flag your interest in the data sprint, people are joining literally day by day. There wasn't a cut-off point. So and I know there are areas where we would like to bolster our capability and our capacity. So please do get in touch with the team. I also said that in parallel to the data sprint and kind of getting the lift up on the pilot up and running, we're currently working through kind of what the application process looks like, what the eligibility criteria look like, and we are doing that absolutely in partnership with City of London Corporation. And so I would say watch this space in terms of further news and updates, which should be coming in early autumn.
And then finally, just because I think that, the FCA has an existing sandbox, and I know you talked about it earlier, but perhaps to just make it clear the differentiation between what you've got and what's coming, so that people are very clear if they do want to get involved about what's expected and where the differentiation lies.
In terms of the range of our innovation services, so Reg Sandbox, yeah,
absolutely.
So So I mean, this is something that we are, very conscious of. What that kind of interface looks like, and how those pieces sit alongside one another. There are no easy answers that I can share today, but it's something that we are thinking through carefully to make sure that we are, as and when we kind of launch this, that we'll be able to kind of we are doing that thinking in a very, very live way.
Thank you. So I think we're probably going to leave it there for the questions. I don't know if any of the speakers had any final thoughts that they wanted to get out there while we've got so many people engaged and interested in the sandbox and what you plan to achieve.
I'm happy to jump in to make up for my poor audio of earlier. Just really to probably reiterate that it's been, it's been a really exciting journey for us so far with the FCA, and we're looking forward to how it's going to progress over the coming weeks. Certainly, expressions of interest can be made on the FCA website still, I'm sure, Francesca. So for those who are watching and are interested, please do go to the website and have a look on what's already up there. And it will be being updated hopefully relatively soon, more, both about what the sandbox is going to look like and also the application process, as Francesca's already said. But I'm very interested to hear about thoughts from you all, given what you've heard today.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I mean, there is information on our website. Please do go and check it out and sort of and get in touch with the team. This is kind of, as we've said, sort of ambitious. We know that there is a need for it. We're really excited to see how it will develop, what will come of the data sprint, and how that will start to roll into the build for the pilot. And I think the number of participants that have been on this call today, the number of participants that are involved in the data sprint, it really speaks to the level of interest, and that is really positive, and I think really exciting to see. So yes, I hope this can be a kind of continuing conversation.
And I guess from an industry perspective, if I may, I guess this is a great development, right? I mean, to open up data in synthetic form to all participants in the market is a real milestone to fuel innovation. So I think the fact that you've got an observation deck where different regulators can come together, the fact that actually there is data to play with will undoubtedly help flush out both policy issues, but also accelerate innovation, in my view, just seeing what's happened with the traditional sandbox. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Thank you. Exciting times ahead. No one's getting any summer holidays this year. Well, thank you all. That's been a really fascinating discussion. Huge thank you to you, Francesca, Mary and Suchitra. Hopefully there's been some insights that have been shared that people can go away, speak to their colleagues and teams about how they can get involved. As Francesca said, if you do want to get involved, there is information on the FCA website in the Digital Sandbox section on both the data sprint, and it will be updated further in the year when the pilot opens for applications. So in the meantime, thank you all for joining us today. We had a great bunch of people on and we had some really interesting engagement. Thank you all for your questions. Have a pleasant day and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.